Hotep, everybody.
Hotep.
My name is Ashoka Deskins. I'm 16 from Oakland, California, and today I'm presenting one of the new Jack Scholars. Dr. Mario Beatty is the son of George Leo Beatty Jr., Ma Carew, or True of Voice, and Mary Beatty. He grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. He received his bachelor's degree in Black World Studies from Miami University, his master's degree in Black Studies from Ohio State University, and his doctoral degree in African American Studies from Temple University. He now resides in Chicago, Illinois, and is a member of the Comet Institute and a chair of the Department of African American Studies at Chicago State University. Now, this seems like a lifetime of education to me. I don't know how he did it, because he looks very, very young, but without further ado, I present to some and introduce to others Dr. Mario Beatty.
My ear. Dr. Mario, let me get you completed here. Right? You can be mobile. Okay. I'm going to squeeze you like that.
All right.
And then you can put that in your pocket if you like, and then you can be mobile.
All right. Great. All right. Hotep Africans. Hotep. May I have permission from my elders to speak and to continue? Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. It seems like a lot of education because it is. And that's why I'm not a new Jack Scholar anymore. I'm an elder Jack Scholar. But you know what? It's wonderful to be here. And if you can see the smile on my face, I'm grinning from east to west. I come from Chicago to L.A., so I'm very happy to be here. Very happy. You know what? This presentation that I want to give this morning, it's called Intellectual Warfare at the International Congress of Egyptology in Rhodes, Greece. And what do we do? You know, the epithet that we append to our ancestors that speak for us, Ma'akeru, true of voice. What do we do when we see the voices that are speaking about our ancestors is not true? And that's where this presentation fits in for me. And with this presentation, what I wanted to do is what Sheikh Anta Diop did in a very small way for me, but is what Sheikh Anta Diop did and Theophile Obenga did in 1974 at the UNESCO conference. What do? You meet them on the world stage and you tell them that their voices are not true. And so this presentation will be given at the International Congress of Egyptology in Rhodes, Greece. This is a conference that meets once every 4 years. It brings together the top Egyptologists in the world. And although this presentation, for the purposes of our presentation today, I have to give more background information and kind of make reference to more secondary information to let you all know the kind of some of the importance of the presentation. But when I get to Rhodes, Greece, all of the secondary sources will be dispensed with. And I will be making reference only to primary source material. So I will only be letting the ancestors speak at that presentation and not not what we have in terms of Egyptology and making these types of scurrilous comments on our history. So, let's see. Here, come up. Is it up? Okay. There we go. Okay, here we go. The title of this presentation for Rhodes, Greece is going to be khesy, Wretched, the Anatomy of a Foreign Relations Concept. And this term right here, khesy, Wretched, this is a very, very important word in the Egyptian language. The Egyptians begin to append this adjective. It's a verb that begins to be used as an adjective, and it begins to be appended to foreign opposition, to enemies, primarily in the Middle Kingdom. And this presentation is about unpacking the origins, the anatomy, and the development of that concept. And here, right here, I'll read it for you. This presentation seeks to address and bring clarity to the anatomy of the foreign relations concept of khesy, Wretched, which I contend was, in essence, a novel symbolic political category that initially arose as a pejorative concept in the micro-politics of Egyptian internal conflicts during the first intermediate period and seamlessly transformed into a newly state-sanctioned ideology and image of foreign enemies after national reunion that represents in discernible ways a fundamental departure from the state ideology of Egyptian domination in the Old Kingdom. What is the importance of this study for us? The importance of this study for us is that Egyptologists have attempted to drive a racial wedge between Egypt and Nubia Kush. How they attempt to drive this racial wedge in between them is based on archaeology, it's based on their interpretation of artistic representations, it's based on reference to Egyptian primary historical documents, and it's based on language. So it's a confluence of all of these things. And of course, this is framing everything. This is framing how we are to see the relationship between Egypt and Nubia in the peopling of the Nile Valley. It's also framing how we are to see their relationship in terms of all historical events. So all historical events between them are funneled through this paradigm. And this paradigm is so entrenched in the field of Egyptology that it's very difficult to break it. But how we begin to break it is to begin to unpack what they have done through using the language, through being inside our own culture, through mastering our own language and presenting the real truth to them in a public forum. So khesy is a verb. It's called a third weak verb in the Egyptian language. It can be used a lot of ways, but its basic meaning is to be weak. And the pejorative semantic extension of this verb is what we get when it's extended to notions and ideas of wretched, of vile, which are applied to foreign enemies. In Coptic, which is the last phase of the Egyptian language, it has both transitive and intransitive uses. No problem there. But in the 19th century, there was a white scholar called George Glidden. This scholar was responsible for popularizing and introducing Egyptology really as kind of a field of study in the United States. Seriously, after Champollion's discovery. He came to the United States in 1837. As his position was, he was a U.S. vice consul at Cairo in Egypt. He came to the United States in 1837 on a tour. And he began to tour all over, and he published a work eventually. And this work was called Ancient Egypt. And George Glidden is the one who in Egyptology attempted to bridge what he did in Egyptology with what scientists, pseudoscientists like Samuel Morton of Philadelphia attempted to do, is to use Egyptian crania to give this presentation or representation of Egypt as truly Caucasian and to give this representation of everything that was to the south as inferior, as black, etc. And so all of these things lead into, they're important because they lead into what we're seeing today with representations that come out of the National Geographic magazine. Yes. That's the importance of this presentation. So they're reading, they didn't accomplish what they thought that they were going to accomplish, because when the layperson sees black pharaohs on the cover of National Geographic, the layperson that says, oh, we got them all. You're finally admitting that all of the pharaohs were black. But when you open the article, okay, when you read the article is only attempting to make reference to the 25th dynasty and the Nubians and the Cushites, and the idea is to call them the unmistakable black pharaohs. But everybody else was not that. But it didn't happen the way that they wanted it to happen. But the seed of that ideology is formed early on in the immediate aftermath of the 19th century. So George Glidden is a popularizer. He learned from Germans, Carl Richard Lepsius. He learned from Samuel Birch, who was the director of the British Museum, carrying on Champollion's work. But in this book on ancient Egypt, and Martin Delaney uses him, constantly critiques Glidden in his work in 1879 on the Principia of Ethnology. But the important thing about George Glidden's work is that when he presents, he's not presenting his own work. He's just presenting the standard view coming from all of the Egyptological publications in the 19th century, based upon when he first published this in 1843. Okay. So what you begin to see here is 1843. George Glidden gives a translation, probably from an early work of Champollion. You got it? So here he is. He sees Cush, and then you see khesy right here. And you see what the translation is. Cush, barbarian country, perverse race. This is 19th century. Okay? And this view of this term khesy is going to just propel all throughout the 19th century to people like Wretched, etc. All of the German Egyptologists hold the same view. And when we get to the modern day, I mean, the people it's too much to even quote all of the scholars. It's in every lexicon. It's in every view, so it's really too much to quote what's going on here. But I want to make special reference to this person, Donald Redford. And this is really kind of the catalyst for this presentation. Hopefully I'm going to meet him in Rhodes, Greece. Okay, because I want to have a talk with him in Rhodes, Greece. Donald Redford wrote a book called From Slave to Pharaoh, The Black Experience of Ancient Egypt. And in this book, Donald Redford attempts to describe the quote-unquote hostility, the animosity, the conflicts between Egypt and Cush. He attempts to say that those conflicts are racial in nature, that those conflicts between these two entities they originate in this deep-seated racial antipathy that the Egyptians have for the Nubians and the Cushites. And you can see this throughout the text. You can see this in artistic representations. So he goes into this kind of pseudo-Freudian psychology to frame the whole analysis of the book. This is what I give right here. The aversion springs spontaneously and unconsciously in the human psyche and is always based initially on observable traits such as color, language, costume, and social practice. And this gives you an indication that he is saying that this, in the Egyptian psyche, they are observing the Nubians as distinctly different in terms of color. Okay? And based on that, then they're creating these negative epithets to describe them. So he's basically saying, they're basically saying that the Egyptians are using this to call the Cushites and the Nubians niggers. That's what it is. These are the niggas, and we're not. And so I want to attempt to try to deal with that. And this is a more recent publication that takes kind of the same view, but in a different way, by this guy, Stuart Tyson Smith, who is actually out here in California. And he published a work called Wretched Kush. And he asked, well, why did the Egyptians call Kush wretched? That's the question that he asked. And how he answers that question is essentially the same as Donald Redford. So Donald Redford sees the adjective khesy as a racial epithet. And so does Stuart Tyson Smith. He views khesy as an ethnic stereotype that was applied by the Egyptians to the Nubians. And as an outgrowth of this stereotype, the Egyptians begin to create this elaborate foreign policy around this. But Stuart Tyson's uniqueness is that he attempts to show theoretically that this view was more propaganda, and he attempts to focus on fortress or frontier communities of Askut and the Tombo cemetery in Kush. He attempts to focus on these locales and to say, well, the actual relationships between Egypt and Kush on the ground were always more complex than the state propaganda or the state ideology. So that's the wrinkle that he puts in his view, but he still accepts the paradigm of Donald Redford. This is a new book also, The Enemies of Civilization by Muchupu. And this is a scholar that attempts to forge a comparative analysis between Egypt, Mesopotamia. Go ahead. Thank you so much. All right. I have one of these myself, but I don't know where it's at. Okay. All right. Between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China. And Muchupu does a much better job of interpreting the evidence, but he doesn't go far enough in terms of the analysis of especially of how this concept of khesy has been used to really make this racial separation between Egypt and Nubia Kush. In another famous article in 1973, published in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, a scholar by the name of David Lorton wrote an article called The So-Called Vile Enemies of Ancient Egypt. And in this article, he takes to task Egyptologists and he says, well, how are we to really define wretched? How are we to really define this term? Because when you look at standard dictionary definitions of this term, it can be one of two things. Wretched can be defined as an object of pity, or it can be defined as an object of content. So which sense do the Egyptians give it, when they are applying this to foreign enemies? So he takes all of this, he cites many texts, and he concludes that, well, at the end of the day, I think that this term actually is more appropriately to be defined as defeated in reference to foreign enemies, as opposed to wretched referring to contempt or pity. But I have a problem with that analysis too, because the Egyptians defeated many enemies, many enemies. But the important point for me is to discern when does khesy as a term come into existence in the Egyptian historical imagination. That's the importance for me. And when we can see the historical development and evolution of this concept, then we can begin to determine the meaning and how it was used. So that's what I'm concerned with, and that's what Egyptologists have not taken on in this study. So, but there is one African scholar who has attempted a little bit of this study, but not through khesy. This is a very famous African scholar teaching at the University of Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar. He writes in French. His name is Babacar Sall. He is the successor to Cheikh Anta Diop, in Africa. He's one of the two successors. So he writes, we all write together in a journal called Ankh, where we all publish African scholars from all over the world. We come together to publish our work on African civilizations by us, for us. And Babakar Sall is one of these great scholars. And this journal comes out of Paris. But Babakar Sall wrote an article called The Memphite Image of Nubia and Sudan. And in this article, Babakar Sall tries to reframe the debate between the two. Because Babakar Sall's point is that the Egyptians, primarily overall, when you look at Egyptian historical texts in the Old Kingdom, the Egyptians have relatively a positive view of Nubia and Sudan. They are integrated, although there are, conflicts throughout, but they are integrated into the Egyptian army. They are integrated into a lot of different complex social relationships with Egypt. So he's saying that even when the Egyptians talk about them, they talk about Nubia and Sudan. They know it very well. They have political intercourse and very friendly, amicable relationships with them. And this is borne out by reference to especially narrative texts in the 6th dynasty, right before the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Because in the 6th dynasty, you begin to see the Egyptians asking the Nubians to fight with them against the Asiatic sand dwellers. Okay, so you begin to see them fighting together against what they perceive as a common enemy. So Babakar Sall's point is that, how did this change? How did this change from the 6th dynasty, where you see the Egyptians and Nubians fighting together in text against Asiatic sand dwellers, and how does this change in the advent of the Middle Kingdom? Very important thesis, but although he doesn't directly deal with the concept of khesy, but his paradigm is very important for my work. Well, the question that I asked was, where is the first reference to khesy in any Egyptian text? That was the first question that I asked. Because what Egyptologists will do, a rhetorical strategy in using khesy, is that they will pretend that the Egyptians had this term from the beginning of civilization, from the beginning of time, since 3200 BC, and they will pretend that they always use this in reference to foreign enemies. So what I wanted to determine was, when did the concept come into existence? And how did it come into existence? The first reference we see of khesy has no mention. It has no political connotations whatsoever. The first time that this term comes into existence is in the instruction of Ptah Hotep. Okay, that's not the Old Testament. That's not the New Testament. That is the oldest testament of our African humanity. Okay, so that text, 2400 BC, that text gives us the initial view of this concept of khesy. And when we see it immediately at the beginning, when the Egyptians are giving advice. Ptah Hotep is giving advice to deal with conflicts. Okay, conflicts between those who are superior, conflicts with your peers, and conflicts between those who are subordinate to you. And all of the solutions that Ptah Hotep gives are virtually the same. Restraint, silence, be cool. Be cool. That is the solution to all of the conflicts. But in this particular text, Ptah Hotep says, if you meet a disputant in action, a poor man, not your equal, do not attack him because he is weak. And here we see khesy. Okay, here it's a relative form, no matter there. But here we see khesy. And we see khesy being indicative. We see it here in its social meaning, in its social context, where Ptah Hotep is saying, don't fight with someone who is weak. Okay, that's not a good solution. Okay, and so he's saying here he will confute himself. And so outside of this, there's only one fleeting reference. There are many references in Ptah Hotep to this term khesy with a social meaning. Khesy as an adjective can be applied to anything. It can be applied to speech, any number of things. But in this basic social sense, it is meaning weak in a real sense. But here, what I wanted to see and what I'm going to bring new to Egyptologists at this presentation in Greeks that they will have never heard before, okay, is this. In the first dynasty, this is a representation of King Din. And what you see on this text, very early on, you see this term right here. This term right here is septepi sequi iabiti. That means that this is the first time of fighting the East. Okay, so this, for the Egyptians, the question that I had in doing this topic was, what is the language that the Egyptians use in the Old Kingdom to convey their sense of domination and conflict with foreign enemies? What is the language that's being used all of the time? And this is a great indication of the type of language that is being used by the Egyptians in the Old Kingdom. The language is always very assertive. The language is always very active. And the words that are being used are always transitive verbs in reference to foreign enemies. So when the Egyptians, and how do I know this? Because I read hundreds of texts in Egypt to just make this small analysis, to just make this small point. Hundreds of texts, and looked at all of the verbs that the Egyptians use in all of the texts that convey their relationship when they're fighting others. And the words, the verbs that they're giving are subduing, smiting, hacking up, killing, destroying, devastating. These are the words that they're used, meaning that enemies are simply cast as merciless foreign objects of the Pharaoh to just be smited. It's very active, okay? There is a total absence, meaning that from the Old Kingdom text, there is a total absence of a pejorative, adjectival characterization of foreign enemies in the Old Kingdom. Complete absence of it. That's a very important point, because even when we begin to look at narrative Egyptian texts, not the mastabas, but the narrative Egyptian text that we begin to get in the 5th and 6th dynasty, where the Egyptians in very descriptive fashion are talking in ways that are reminiscent of texts that we would see in the first intermediate period and the Middle Kingdom. When we begin to see how they're casting, this is a text, a very famous text from the inscriptions of Uni. Uni was the overseer of royal tenants, and he became the governor of Upper Egypt. And Uni is this official who actually asked Nubians, very familiar with different rulers of Nubia, from different parts of Nubia. And he asked Nubians to come and fight on the side of the Egyptians against the Asiatic sand dwellers. And here, when he is giving this description, he's saying the army returned in safety. It had ravaged the sand dwellers' land. The army had returned in safety. It had flattened the sand dwellers' land. The army returned in safety. It had sacked its strongholds. And on and on and on. But the point that I want to make here is that in Uni's text, in a context where we would expect to see wretched come up as a pejorative characterization of foreign enemies, is completely absent. Okay? It's completely absent. And that's a very important point to see, because this is my key question. How did the meaning of khesy expand from being a purely social category in the Old Kingdom into a political category in the first intermediate period, used to describe opponents, both domestic and foreign? And so now, in order to deal with this moment, we come to what Mary Carre calls the time of trouble. And this is when the Egyptians are fighting themselves. And this text of Mary Carre in the first intermediate period, Egyptologists will say, well, this text can't be used to convey historical events, because we're not sure of the exact historical events that are described in the text. Well, maybe not, but it can definitely be used to convey an accurate historical mood of the time. And that's very important, because that still allows us to use these types of texts in conveying the sense of how they cast each other in their conflict during this time. So essentially, this is a period of 150 years where the Egyptians are not united, where there are moments of relative peaceful coexistence, but there are also moments of very charged conflict all over the Nile Valley between themselves. So after the death of Pepi II in the Second Kingdom, who had a very long reign, the Egyptian government kind of collapsed for a whole host of reasons. And primarily what you get as an outgrowth in this first intermediate period are regional fragmentation, regional cleavages. You get the emergence of unique leadership identities of distinction that are in opposition to Pharaoh, that are in opposition to the seat of governance in Memphis. From Memphis, you get, these kind of, murky, kind of rulers that continue on after Pepi II, but not really very strong. And then, of course, you get the move up to Heracleopolis, where there is a founding, which Mary Carre represents the end of that period in the Cleopolitan period. But he represents the very end of that period where they are fighting Upper Egypt. A lot of places in Upper Egypt, primarily Thebes or Waset. And so this is a fight that is ongoing for 150 years. And we underestimate the impact of this moment on what the Egyptians would do after they came out of this moment. We underestimate the impact of what the Egyptians did to one another in their civil war in this moment. And so what I begin to say here in the instruction of Mary Carre in the time of trouble, what Mary Carre calls the wreck in men, is that Mary Carre gives khesy is all over this text. Okay, it is in so many different phrases in this text. And this is where you begin to see the political connotations of khesy emerge. Khesy does not emerge as an ethnic stereotype. Khesy does not emerge as a racial epithet applied to Cush. Khesy emerges as a concept in the context of the Egyptian civil war, where they are using this to cast themselves as the enemy. They themselves are the enemy against each other. And this is how khesy emerges as a political concept in the Egyptian historical imagination. And we see this all over this text in many descriptive ways. So these are many references. And of course, let me go. I think I skipped some. The foe loves destruction and wretched deeds. Sep khesy for destroying is wretched. Lo, the wretched Asiatic. He is wretched because of the place he is in. But I think I missed one that is very important. Let me go back. Okay. Yeah. The one that I wanted to show is a wretch is he who desires the land of a neighbor. Khesy. They're not talking about Nubia. They're not talking about Cush. They're talking about themselves. Okay? Because this is when the land was divided up. And they're saying, if you want my stuff, you khesy, you're wretched. And they're saying also here, you have the same adjective. You even have it as an adjective applied to a successor. So Mary Carre is saying, may I see a brave man copy it, having done more than what I have done. Or no, I'm sorry, as Mary Carre is the successor. He's saying a wretched heir would disgrace me. So khesy, yuau khesy. He's saying that I have given a plan, guiding principles, a guideline for the Egyptian state, for foreign policy, from Heracleopolis, where Mary Carre is from. And he's telling Mary Carre that if you don't follow what I have laid out in this teaching, then you are khesy. Yuau khesy. You are wretched. You are not following what I have laid out for you. So you begin to see that the Egyptians are constantly using They're even making reference to the deeds that they are doing to each other in the first intermediate period. They're saying a wretched deed occurred in my time. The nome of this was ravaged. Khesy. In my time, a wretched deed was occurred. So these are Egyptians talking about themselves, okay, not the Nubians and Cushites. So what do we see here also in the first intermediate period is that this is probably the most famous text, the famous biographical text in the first intermediate period of pretty much any official. It's a very famous tomb that is found in Moala. Moala is a place that's just 30 miles south of Thebes, Waset. But Ankh-Tefi was the nomarch, or the head, the leader of the second and third Egyptian nomes of Edfu and Hierakonpolis. And Ankh-Tefi is fighting. Okay, Ankh-Tefi wants to wage a war. He is very braggadocious. I mean, he is very audacious. He is very loquacious in the presentation of his leadership style. He's, very almost bombastic in a sense in a lot of the things that come out in this text. But he is saying here, and the key point is that Ankh-Tefi is to let you know how weak the royal residence is at this time. Ankh-Tefi is not even making reference to a pharaoh, pretty much. So these are rulers who are provincial, who have been given power. The royal residence decentralized itself because of the complexity. The Egyptian nation was almost a victim of its own success. And in order to deal with the complex bureaucracy, the complex management of a nation state, in the Old Kingdom, the Egyptian central government was very tightly controlled from Memphis. Very tightly controlled, even with family members. But the complexity, they had to decentralize. And in the first intermediate period, we see it in the beginnings in the 6th dynasty, but we see them being decentralizing rule amongst leaders and appointing leaders in these various regions in Egypt. And these leaders begin to gain more power. And in the first intermediate period, in a moment of weakness, when there's no longer the confidence in the Egyptian central government in Memphis and the successors of that governance, when there is no longer confidence in the royal residence, there are leaders all throughout Egypt who begin to act really solely independently. And Ankh-Tefi is representative of that new type of spirit of the Egyptian leader in the first intermediate period that is acting on his own, saying, these are things that I did, not Pharaoh. So he's talking about himself and what he did to reestablish the nome of Edfu. And he's also saying that, where is it at? I found the domain of Ku, the administrator, like a swampy estate neglected by its keeper in a condition of civil strife and under the lead of a wretch. Now I caused a man to embrace those who had killed his father or brother. These are Egyptians talking about themselves in the first intermediate period, not Cush, Nubia. Ankh-Tefi once again, but every ignorant person, every wretch who opposed me, I retaliated against him for his deeds. Once again, we see this paradigm from the Egyptians. So, how does this play out with Nubia and Cush? Once the first intermediate period is over, when you have Mentuhotep taking the reins, really being the catalyst for the emergence of Egypt from Thebes into the Middle Kingdom with the Menemet, what you begin to see is that the Egyptian nation, when it comes back together as a nation, it begins to change its policy, its foreign policy. And in terms of trade, in terms of commerce, what the Egyptians, of course, want, they want to control the trade. Even from the beginning of Egyptian civilization, they always thought that the land between the first and second cataract was part of theirs. Okay, but they were unsuccessful because the material culture between Egypt and Nubia Kush is very close, is very similar in fundamental ways. But the Egyptians, it took them a long time to subdue the Kushite or the Nubians early on in the period. They were successful in subduing. The Upper Egyptians were successful in subduing Lower Egypt, but they were not as successful in subduing the area between the first and second cataract. That was always a problematic area for them. So in terms of what they do coming out of the first intermediate period, the Egyptians begin to build fortresses. Because of the building of the dam, these fortresses are now underwater. But this fortress of Buhin is really indicative of the Egyptian foreign policy. And you don't build fortresses to people who you think are weak or wretched. You only build fortresses. They didn't build fortresses in Western Asia. Okay? They didn't build fortresses in Wretched. They didn't build fortresses in Palestine. The only place that the Egyptians built fortresses were on the edge so that they wouldn't let the Asiatics in. But where they built fortresses at was in reference to Kush, because they knew that the emergence of Kush was a rival, was a power, was a state that could absolutely challenge their domination. So this is akin to, as Dr. Thompson was saying, this is akin to England and France fighting. These are powers fighting. Okay? So we have to find ways to, what Egyptologists would have us do is to racialize these concepts, to racialize this whole framework, so then you begin to read race, and their races fuse into everything that happens between Egypt and Nubia Kush. And it's much more complex than that on so many levels. So, in conclusion, for the Egyptians, national reunion was mediated in part through attacks on foreign enemies. Because in this sense, the Egyptians are saying, when the Egyptians come out of the first intermediate period, what they are saying is that the enemy was them. And so they have to begin to refocus the nation on state-sponsored political and economic goals. How do you do that when you have just spent 150 years and you have been the enemies of yourself? So part of how they did that was turning the tables and saying, khesy is not us anymore. It's not us anymore, it's them. Okay? It's Kush. It's Wretched. It's the Amu. It's the Libyans. They are the ones. So the Egyptians are using this in fundamental ways to convince themselves that they are no longer the enemies of each other. Okay. Also, Egypt had to reimagine the foreign enemy in order to reaffirm Egyptian self-consciousness and unity as a nation. The focus on external threats implicitly lessened the undeniable impact of the civil war in the Egyptian national memory. So the conflicts between Nubia and Kush and Egypt did not arise from so-called ethnic and cultural differences or ethnic stereotype or racial prejudice or any of that, but it arose from the broader political and economic environment which shaped the nature of the competition between them. What is needed is a whole new theoretical framework to systematically examine and focus on the implications of subtle changes in Egyptian national identity over time, especially during times of trouble. So we treat Egypt, especially during these intermediate periods, we treat that intermediate period as if it was just a year or 2 years and not 150 years. And we miss a lot of the historical development and dynamics of what's going on during those moments. Also, what is needed is greater attention to issues of lexicography that focuses our attention on clarifying the historical development and nuanced meanings of individual words. I would be dealing with this in a more technical way in Greece. I didn't do that here. The use of khesy as a pejorative adjectival characterization represented a fundamentally new way to conceptualize foreign enemies in the Middle Kingdom and would endure for the remainder of the Egyptian civilization. We need to explain the specific social historical context of how khesy as a pejorative concept came into being in the Egyptian imagination as a new political concept, as opposed to pretending that it always existed as a pejorative characterization of foreign enemies since the beginning of Egyptian civilization. And with respect to the dynamic of change in Egyptian foreign policy and historical development, we need to pay closer attention to. So just like the United States has a foreign policy that develops over time, Cold War, etc., we don't treat Egypt in that way, okay? So they treat Egypt as if it has kind of a stock foreign policy in reference to enemies, but it's not like that. In periods of peace, Egypt does not use the adjective khesy in reference to Cush or others. In periods of conflict, they use it. But khesy as a term, when it is used, they do not use khesy in reference to weak people. They use khesy explicitly to describe nations or entities that they see as fundamental challenges to their national interests in very real ways. And that is how you begin to unpack what Egyptologists have done for the last 200 years. With this term, with this concept, with this history, you begin to unpack them from the inside. Let our ancestors speak and let their falsehood fall. Thank you.
Let the ancestors speak.
Wonderful.
Dr. Mario Beatty, let the ancestors speak. Come on, Baba J.
Where the Egyptologists they pretend, to us. Once you know the language, you can get. Once you know the language, you can see what they are doing very clearly. And as I'm reading these texts, and especially in the Middle Kingdom, and I'm looking at the words and how things are being cast, it is clear that so many misrepresentations of the historical information are evident, and it is so easy to unpack. Even so many mistranslations, So even when we begin to look at the historical evidence in the Middle Kingdom, one stock image that you will see Egyptologists always make reference to is something called the boundary stele of Senwosret III. All Egyptologists have to make reference to this to describe, how the Egyptians used to describe the Nubians and Cushites as wretched. Well, when I looked at that text and I read that text, I realized that the Egyptians only used khesy in that text only one time, and they used it in reference to themselves. And so, in a basic nominal sentence, they say to attack is brave. To not attack is khesy. That's how they use it. So they're saying that, Senwosret III in creating these fortress communities and creating the Buahin, but these boundary steles were placed at Uranarti and Sinna around the Second Cataract. But the Egyptians are saying in these texts that they're asking their successors to fight for them, but they're also using these terms of khesy and not in the way that the Egyptologists would have us think that they're using them. Okay, so these are very real political conflicts, and that's how we should see them. We should unracialize these conflicts. We should not make references to culture, to costume, to language. This concept is not a pejorative in that sense. Okay, it is not to be seen in that sense. And when we begin to clarify this, for me, this was major, and that's why I'm presenting it there, because I want them to see that there are African scholars that are now on the scene, and that are able to deal with them wherever they go, wherever they are, and they're not going to get away with it. They're not going to write these cheap pieces in National Geographic and get away with it anymore. Okay? So we are here now. Our scholarship is here now, all the world. It's over.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.